Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast featuring Kate Riga. We are recording on Wednesday, April 23rd, a little after noon, and we got a bunch of interesting things to talk about. We're going to talk about I'm going to talk about Pete Hegseth. We're going to talk about the Supreme Court. We are going to talk about those couple hundred, mostly or almost entirely Venezuelan nationals in the gulag down in El Salvador, and then we're gonna probably finish up with some brief discussion of the passing of Pope Francis, the first papal Francis. Most of the names, most of the regnal names come with Fred the 23rd, John the 90th. The first pope who took the name Francis, also the first Jesuit who became pope, which is a sort of a funny kind of thing since the Jesuit order has been around for quite a long time, almost 500 years, even though it was disbanded for I don't know, a few decades at one point. But sort of funny because the one of the central points of the Jesuit order is obedience to the Pope. I mean, Catholic orders all, it's kind of part of the deal. You follow the Pope, but it's actually like a cardinal part of the Jesuit order. Anyway, let's jump right in. I'm just gonna go to Kate because we've seen Pete Hegseth. He was kind of out of the news for a while. We had that Jeff Goldberg thing with the Signal chat, and that went on for a little bit, and then it was sort of out of the papers. But now we found out there's a second Signal chat. This one didn't have a kind of an um, accidentally added prestige journalist, but it had Hegseth's wife and his brother. And his brother is actually in the Pentagon, but kind of not in a real job. So it's also the nepotism part of Pete's world. And funny thing about, one of the interesting things about Signal Chat round one is that it was really Mike Waltz who was kind of took the brunt of it. And it seemed for a while that he might lose his job. And that was because, it's always been a little unclear what led to him adding Jeff Goldberg to that Signal chat, but he did it. So that was sort of, and that always was a little ironic because, probably everyone has inadvertently added someone to a text chain, or, you think you're texting one person and you accidentally are texting a different person, kind of that happens. But that's one reason you don't use Signal, which is basically a texting app, albeit with higher security, to do your war planning meeting. So that is all happening, and it's also, I think we know that there's this rumbling about the Pentagon that we know things are way more chaotic and fucked up than we're actually seeing. So what do you think, Kate? What is this? Where are we on this meta Pete Pete meta story?
Well, even after the Signal chat, we had kind of a purge of the top three of his top aides who he brought in with him, right? Like these are not
Right, they're not the
Pentagon
deep state,
guys,
they're the
these are
bros.
Hegseth guys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
And on their way out, the explanation was, well, They're leakers, basically. We did a leaking investigation. It's never been totally clear to me what the leaks are about, like, vaguely Ukraine related, just kind of, this broad, cloud of stuff.
Wasn't there also the China thing kind of I guess the point is they didn't tell us, but I thought that and I have I may have just thought wrongly, but we know there was that thing where he tried to read Elon Musk in on, like, all the China
Right.
stuff, and then it got dribbled out, so I don't know if that was what they were accused of, who
Yeah.
knows?
General leakery, I would say, and these 3 guys left, and now they're in this, like, internecine fight with his chief of staff who is being demoted, basically, not fired, but moved into a new role on the heels of all this, and you've got this group of the 3 fired guys and the ex-chief of staff kind of making media rounds, like Tucker Carlson interviews, Ryan Grimm interviews, like, kind of trying to unsully their particular role in
They
this,
talked to Ryan
triangulation.
Grimm?
Yep,
I mean, how far the mighty have fallen, and I don't
yep,
and I'm not just to be clear here, I'm not saying Grimm is low, but he's pretty far but politically pretty far I mean, that's things have come a pretty far way if they're talking to Ryan Grimm about
right.
their story.
So they're all nipping at each other's heels now. And then you also had this Politico op-ed written by Hegseth's outgoing spokesperson in some role who had been kind of offered a promotion coming off what was more of kind of a transitory getting him into the role job, and then he was offered something a little meatier and he said no, and then he wrote this op-ed where if you can kind of bushwhack through all the now listen, no one's more obsessed with Trump than I am kind of stuff, he just lays it out under his own name. It's chaos. People think he's on the way out. It's collapsing, and this guy is like a diehard, like really bought into the mission and is just saying it's completely falling apart at the seams. There needs to be a replacement. He kind of called for Trump to replace Hegseth in the piece. So, and then you had the first Republican kind of go on the record saying that he should resign. And I think there was some feeling because all these events happened in really quick succession. And then you had Don Bacon say, who is somewhat of an idiosyncratic Republican in terms of, he's a Biden district Republican. He's always one of the most vulnerable Republican members. So, he has more incentive to kind of buck the MAGA heart than the rest of them do. But it came on the tail end of Signal-gate 2, the oustings, the starting leaking about the oustings, and then a Republican came out. And I think you got the feeling like, okay, snowball's rolling down the hill, right? Like we're getting to a point where there's enough momentum that he's going to be ousted. But now that was all a few days ago. There's been kind of a stalling momentum, which in a funny way kind of mirrors his confirmation stuff too. There was a time there where it felt all but certain that,
Yeah, he was
you could
done.
get the head of lettuce out kind of thing in the next few hours. He was out and then momentum stalled. But by momentum stalled, I mean Musk and Co. kind of dumped in millions of dollars to stop the momentum from rolling. But it does feel like we're in a similar place now where it's become less, put your $5 in on like in what hour Hegseth will be fired and more like, are we just going to be on to the next thing? Because, Trump is not a dependable actor here, but he was asked about it. He said, "Oh, Pete's great. We love Pete. Everyone loves Pete." Right? The press secretary did a little. Well, it's really hard when the whole Pentagon is against you, which is like, well, I mean, it's your Pentagon, but whatever. So that's where we're at now.
Now, wasn't I think, somewhat similar to the confirmation drama, I th I can't remember which day this was, but I think part of the dynamic here is that he went on Fox and kind of did the, I'm fighting the deep state, and,
Yep.
he just sort of one thing that caught my attention is I mean, I'm not even sure why I say he totally lied. I mean, everything this guy says is nonsense,
Right.
but he said this thing about how, oh, this wasn't like these weren't like war plans or any kind of classified information. He actually said this was like kind of like media coordination information, which like, dude, no, like what it's. I was telling someone yesterday that, you know, I don't know that world. So based on what was in the texts, I wouldn't be able to say, "Oh, wow, that's hardcore stuff," versus like, "Yeah, whatever, that's meaningless." But like every every general or anybody involved in this stuff who they ask about it is like, "Yeah, that's the top stuff. That's the super secret stuff that no one can ever find out." So anyway, he did that. I take it that played some role in sort of bucking up Trump because, Trump never wants to pull the plug on someone who's, you know, doing that thing. And that's how he saved himself in their confirmation. He kind of went
Right.
on the offensive and then, because there's always that moment uh where they'll put out through a place like Politico or something like, yeah, we're looking for the replacement. You know, party's over. And yet some as often as not, the party's not over,
Right.
right? So,
And that was
yeah.
an NPR headline a day or 2 ago, the search for the replacement is on. Um, and it's getting a little bizarre, the kind of refusal to move on from Hegseth. I think probably the best reasons are, if it comes time to say, tell the military to shoot protesters, Hegseth will probably do it. So, I
Mhm.
mean, Trump wants him there for that. I think also you think back to his confirmation, he needed JD Vance to bail him out, right? It's not like it was a real comfortable margin. And I think you're unlikely to get someone so unqualified and like such a kind of pure toady around the next time in. Um, but I do want to read this one tweet from Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, who I just think good context. His kind of professional life before he came into Congress was not anything having to do with the military. He took over his dad's plumbing business. Okay, here's the tweet. I will lead the breach. I will lay down cover fire. I will take the high ground. I'll expose myself to enemy fire to communicate. We must bring back integrity, focus, and put the warfighter first inside DOD. I stand with Pete Hegseth. So,
It's
American flag emoji.
yeah, it's funny that, one of the things that not o there's a problem with him and Trump and a lot of these guys with basic it's not diction exactly. It's just kind of the basic jargon that you don't lead the breach. You can't lead the breach. The breach is a
Right.
hole, right? It's an opening in the line. So, like, it's like when Trump said always saying they were playing the ref. Well, you don't play the ref. The ref is the ref. You work the ref. I mean, these are
Right.
admittedly in our times, these are not the greatest problems, but
Well, did you see the tweet that everyone in the world was making fun of a new hire at like DHS or DOD or something? And do you know what I'm talking about? It's
oh,
something about
like this ex Breitbart woman or something. This wait, or
no.
this is something. Oh, this is what it is. This is a little more news. The Department of the Navy, the head of communications for the Department of the Navy, as of yesterday or something, is this reporter from Breitbart. So little news flash there.
So there's an this is apropos of absolutely nothing, but there's a new DoD appointment, and this is the tweet. I'm excited and honored to announce I've been appointed to the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the DoD, helping ensure our country is viewed as a force not to be reckoned with. So
Yeah, it's hard. It's
not
hard
quite,
teaching
not
sometimes.
quite. And then people in the comments are like, ripping him to shreds and being like, you used the phrase wrong. That means you want America to be weak. And in response, he asked Grok, the AI feature on Twitter, what the phrase means, and it confirmed his misuse of the phrase. So he was like, "See, you're all the idiots. I'm not the idiots. You're the idiots."
There's so much contained in this one little anecdote.
Yep.
Let me ask you one thing because this is part of this I didn't I had not caught. So you're saying there was okay. So there's the three fired guys who are like Pete Bros that he brought in, and then there's a fourth bro who was half fired. He wasn't fired, he's still in, but he's, like, kinda demoted, and
Mhm.
he is still on Team Pete, and so the 3 and he are going at it
Right.
because he's still on Team Pete, and they're now I don't know, they're deep state now.
Right. And so this guy Joe Casper, who was Hegseth's number one, a lot of these like drippy pieces that are coming out paint him as the crux of the dysfunction. Various anecdotes like they were at a meeting with some veteran group and it devolves into allegedly him telling tales of like a night out at a strip club in DC, another high official meeting where he
Like, since
stops.
they took over the Pentagon?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Another meeting where he's regaling everyone with like the bowel movement he just had. It just like this, which makes sense, right? I mean, these are Hegseth's people. It's
Yeah.
like totally plausible. But he's the one, and like I was trying to read some of these pieces and I honestly found them hard to follow because it's so like internecine and it's so like, well, you did this, and there's apparently some, maybe an IG report about this guy, or at least a reporter had called to ask about the IG report, and the way one of these guys had handled it made Casper really mad. Whatever. It's like palace intriguey stuff. But, you know, there's just a cyclone of disaster. And it all stems from the same place we thought it would, which is Hegseth was clearly totally incompetent to do the job. And the only way that you could maybe possibly mitigate that damage is to surround him by serious people who do know how to do the job. But their first action was chopping the heads off of like all the kind of old timers that had any tie to Biden. And a ton of these guys have
In
served for many
including the chairman
presidencies,
of the
right?
Joint Chiefs of Staff,
Exactly.
which is like
And
yeah.
and they have this, they just clearly, there was the best write up of the drama I've read was in the New York Times. And they were talking about how there's they just don't have an understanding that like a lot of career, what it means to be a career official in the Pentagon is that you have been there for many a presidency, right? And that your appointment is not necessarily so closely tied to your behavior as it is in like other echelons of the government. So, there were some stories in there about people at the Pentagon saying that Hegseth's people are asking them to like prove their patriotism, to like give them an extended CV to kind of like prove that they're not deep state officials. A galling detail is I think 3 of them had told the Times that like all 3 had done tours in Afghanistan, 2 had been wounded there, right? So quite something to kind of like show a weekend Fox News host fill in that information. So, you know, that is the total mess going on there. And it's just, it's classic MAGA stuff, right? You can't apologize, you can't back off, you can't admit you make a mistake. And meanwhile, Hegseth polls dismally worse than Trump, worse than Musk. Like nobody likes Pete Hegseth. And even a majority of Republicans think that the signal stuff is really bad, right? So it is just a kind of classic Trumpian bite off your nose to spite your face thing of just being like, we can't give the mainstream media a scalp, right? So got to keep him in his position.
The one thing I wonder about with him is that I mean, look, obviously, it very clearly any other political moment, any other administration, the original signal thing, he's gone, and probably the NSA is gone, and it's just like a bomb blast that takes everybody out. That didn't happen. It's clear, I hadn't heard the stuff about hitting the strip club. I mean, it's a small town. But in any case, what I but we know that's who he is, right? I mean, we know that's his world, so it doesn't surprise us that there's going to be a lot of broing and little kind of spy versus spy Trumpy stuff. But we keep hearing chaos, chaos. It's chaos. So this must mean more than signal chats, right? And the Pentagon is a big bureaucracy, and yes, they've fired a number of the top generals. But like, there's a lot about the Pentagon that it moves of itself, right? I mean, you've got the head of the head of the Pacific Fleet out there running the Pacific, and you've got CENTCOM, and you've got these. So I keep wondering, what do they mean? Because like they're I keep hearing these reports that there is, you see the signal stuff, you see the broing, but there's a chaos that goes way beyond that. And I keep wondering, like, that sounds bad because the signal stuff and the broing sounds pretty bad. And it sounds it just sounds like there is something more thoroughgoing than we realize. And that's not great because, as much as it's terrifying for me to think about, Trump getting into some sort of military crisis, he's the only president available. So, you don't want the Pentagon to be like falling apart. And I just don't know what that means. Right. So,
And to put a
weird.
real kind of surrealist bow on this, I think the first time Hegseth addressed the allegations, or maybe it was after the Fox thing, but reporters asked him about it, and he like goes on this rant and is yelling about everyone and the leakers and the mainstream media. Meanwhile, he is flanked by his children who are at the White House for the Easter egg roll. So like all the kids in the background are running around with eggs. There's like that giant bunny everywhere, and like his kids just have these like pained frozen smiles on their face while he like rails against the deep state. So, just have that image in your mind.
Yeah. All right. So I guess as of this moment, we think that he has we're in the post storm. Tell me about the poll? Because I always wonder about, in normal times, like I'm sure if you would have like polled Lloyd Austin,
Mhm.
you would have gotten like 15% name recognition, right? No one
Totally.
no one knew who he was. But that's something about the Trump cinematic universe. I feel like people know who Pete, uh,
Mhm.
it certainly the people in the Fox world and kind of everybody. The polls were just like
Yeah, so
just
this was
terrible even for Trump and Elon
yeah,
territory.
Harry Enton did a little, segment on this on CNN today, and it has Hegseth is at -14 favorability, Trump is at
Mhm.
-5, um, and in this quote, Pete Hegseth, at this particular point, is the least liked cabinet member in Donald Trump's administration. In fact, he is the least liked Secretary of Defense. You have to go all the way back to Donald Rumsfeld to find a Secretary of Defense who is less liked than Pete Hegseth is. So,
It's almost funny because Don Rumsfeld was I think rightly known as being a very capable administrator. He had some bad ideas and he did some bad things, but he was not incompetent. If anything, he was sort of like a legendarily from his first tours in Washington back in the 70s, sort of a legendarily competent in the sense of an administrator, very capable administrator. So sort of uh, uh, sad shade on the ghost of Don Rumsfeld being compared to this guy. I still feel like you might want to put a bet on him making a year because one of these is going to blow up in some weird direction that it becomes too much.
I mean, not to be macabre, but doesn't it feel like sooner or later soldiers are going to die because of him? I mean, that feels like one that it's going to be harder for the Trump administration to brush off.
Yeah, well, there's always soldiers die for a lot of reasons. And sometimes, there was that case in was it Latvia? They were I can't remember, it was Latvia or Lithuania. about a month ago. They were doing some NATO exercises right up near the border of Belarus, and 4 soldiers basically drove their tank into a swamp. And that sounds like, oh, that was dumb, but it's one of these areas where kind of like, tanks are very heavy, and you don't know the terrain that well. You go onto kind of wet terrain, you could just sink very fast. In any case, I kind of wondered there because, again, it's a big army. They do a lot of kinetic things. People die, and often it's the case like that where you're like, "Why did that happen?" And if you already have a Secretary of Defense who doesn't have a lot of credibility, sometimes those can kind of blow up on him, even if they didn't really have anything to do with them. So yes, there's the cases of maybe next time we bomb the Houthis, they've got the coordinates and they're sitting there with howitzers or something, and they blow the
Right.
planes out of the air. But it could also just happen with something dumb that doesn't have anything to do with him, and it's just he becomes a liability.
I mean, we know he's using his personal phone on all these signal chats that are leaked. I mean, it's just I know that they don't care about doing this kind of, like, security stuff, but it's not security theater for the top government officials not to use their personal phones. The reason people don't do it is because you can pretty much guarantee that foreign governments, if they have not succeeded, are taking their best whack at cracking those devices, right? That's why responsible people in this position will, like, not even bring their phones on trips with them if they're going into kind of, quote unquote enemy territory of any kind, because that's a constant concern, right? I mean, he's an idiot. And it's
Yeah,
just, he has so much responsibility, I don't know.
yeah, yeah. No, there's the one thing is that it would not surprise me if on round one you've got some high level generals at the PLA thinking like, "Fuck, we didn't even think of signal." And like, that's so stupid. Like, it didn't even occur to us, right? But now it's probably occurred to them, right?
Right.
I think they know to kind of like, hey, can we go to can we go onto the Facebook interface and buy buy the data off Pete's phone,
Right.
right? Because this so yeah, so yeah, well, and there's even other things, we have sort of, it seems like ancient history when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was fired, which is never happened. There's some times where someone has left early because we're left after 2 years, but what that is totally unprecedented. They got the new guy who supposedly had kind of won Trump's affection by doing um, a briefing for him back in 2017, wearing a MAGA hat, as a serving general. Um, what I didn't realize until after that is he hasn't even been a career general. He was basically in the reserves a lot of that time, or a significant amount of that time. Um, and that's not great. I mean, you actually have to be a 4-star. I mean, legally, you have to be a 4-star general to have that, to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Y- You should you should at least only have been a general. So it's not just Pete. There's uh that's not a great situation. But again, I keep wondering, it sounds like there is stuff that is going beyond the sort of the C-suite of the office of the Secretary of Defense, that is causing chaos in its interface with the rest of the Pentagon. And that's worrisome.
So now let's talk about the updates with the Supreme Court and the Alien Enemies Act, because things are moving really quickly and at decidedly non-business hours in this case. And we kind of previewed this last pod that there was growing concern that we were hearing at TPM from some of our sources that the administration was gearing up to ship more Venezuelan detainees out. And we had been in this, like, weird place where the Supreme Court said no to Boasberg's Judge Boasberg's, nationwide class and his TRO. They said, no, you have to do these individual habeas petitions in the districts they're being held. And pretty predictably, this was snowballing into a crisis late last week because, the ACLU and the other kind of lawyers for the detainees had basically said, okay, got back to work, tried to get these temporary restraining orders in the specific districts where most of these immigrants were being held. And they got one in Colorado, they got one in the Southern District of New York, they got one in the Southern District of Texas. They did not get one in the Northern District of Texas. There, you have this guy, Wesley Hendricks, Trump appointee, who basically said, nah, the government said they're not going to move anyone out, so you don't need a restraining order, kind of you're good. And as we know now, the administration then, kind of taking advantage of the no nationwide injunction, started moving everyone to the Northern District of Texas, the one place where they weren't being bound by a restraining order to this facility in Bluebonnet. And the ACLU is kind of like realizing what they're doing and is getting really panicked. And we're getting a bunch of reports about people being loaded onto buses. So they are just like spewing attempts to get relief kind of across the board, right? They go back to Hendricks and say, they're moving people out. We really need this. They do the Fifth Circuit, the appellate court that governs Hendricks, seek emergency repeal there. They seek emergency relief at the Supreme Court. They even go back to Boasberg to say, can you do this? Like, we still kind of have a nationwide class that's like somewhat live in this case, and Boasberg sets an emergency hearing immediately Friday evening, and he says he's, quote, sympathetic to the case, but he just doesn't think he can do a nationwide temporary restraining order when the Supreme Court kind of just said, no, you can't do that. And that's what he said in the hearing. He's like, I get it, but you're asking me to do something they just said I can't do, right? So he denied the appeal. Hendricks said, well, you've already asked the Fifth Circuit, so it's kind of out of my hands, not my jurisdiction now. And then, so we're kind of waiting on the Fifth Circuit while they're going all the way up to the Supreme Court. And this is all happening on Friday, and kind of behind the scenes, we're all just like, what do you do? How do you kind of cover all this at once? Because there's also a feeling of a lot of these orders could be immediately superseded because every single level of the federal court system is being involved at once. And you're also concerned because at that Friday hearing Boasberg had, he is asking Drew Ensign, the DOJ guy, are you moving out detainees right now, right? This weekend? And Ensign is like, no, we're not doing any Friday, but, we reserve the right to do some on Saturday, in complete disregard for the old Supreme Court ruling, right? That required the detainees get notice and enough time to have a hearing and everything. So even if you're kind of taking the DOJ at their word, the moment the clock strikes midnight, right, you're worried that the immigrants in Bluebonnet are going to start getting shipped off. So I think what's was an extraordinary order. The Supreme Court rules just after midnight on Saturday saying you can't take any of these people in the Northern District out of here until this court rules again. And one of the most extraordinary things about it is it says Alito's writing a dissent. That'll come later. So, what we can tell from that order is that, they were not willing to wait for the Fifth Circuit to rule, right? Which is like the kind of ordinary course of events. They didn't even wait for the government to respond to the ACLU's emergency petition. And they wouldn't wait for Alito to finish writing. They said, we're getting this out right now. And, Alito's thing then came late the next day, 5 pages, joined by Thomas, largely procedural stuff, and then kind of quibbling with doing that classic thing of, well, these are unusual circumstances. And, the court has kind of behaved unusually without acknowledging the reason why the court is behaving unusually. So, complaining about things like the government hasn't had a chance to respond, which, like, yeah, that's not really regular order, but that kind of happens all the time with emergency relief. Like, every time the court grants an administrative stay, you've almost never gotten a response from the other side, right? And then he did a whole, we got to trust the executive. They said no more deportations planned Friday or Saturday. And I mean, that's not even true. Like, the DOJ guy openly contemplated deporting people on Saturday. So, that's where we are now. And I think, in contrast to that first order where they said, okay, you have to facilitate um, Abrego
Yeah,
Garcia's removal in that separate case, which
right.
left a lot of wiggle room, and people, trying to read the tea leaves there was kind of difficult because you felt like, okay, it's better than saying no, let him rot there, but it certainly gives the Trump administration a lot of kind of room to dance. This
Yeah.
one was definitive. It was, you will not remove anyone until you hear from us again. So I think that is kind of the most optimistic sign we've gotten from the Supreme Court yet on this whole disappearing the Venezuelans thing.
Yeah, there's w- when I don't understand most of the substance of the law in these cases, or especially the procedural niceties of it. But when I read Alito's thing, certainly in the context of, like, yeah, well, he'll get to it when he wakes up in the morning, something like that. It struck me as, like, I think he's cranky and just didn't like it, and he's kind of fumbling around. This didn't look quite right, and this didn't strike me as fine, and this thing was highly irregular. And they're like, dude, what are you actually disagreeing with? Like,
Totally.
it just kind of, it made him feel bad or so, but I think more, we know who Alito is at this. I mean, he actually manages in some cases, I think, to be somehow sometimes worse than Thomas, because there are these rare cases where Thomas has these often obscure and frequently terrible points of principle that are big to him, that don't line up with what Trump wants at that given moment. And he will often stick to those obscure points of principle. But that seems beyond Alito, right? There are no obscure points of principle. He just wants to do what Trump wants him to do. And in this case, he didn't. It seemed to me he just didn't like that the Supreme Court was getting in Trump's grill,
Yep.
and he just wanted to say no, and then he sort of fumbled around with these sort of procedural things. But I think you're right on the overall point, and that is something that smart lawyers always say you don't want to do with the judge, is you get the judge thinking you cannot be trusted. Like, you can't be given any of the um uh just the basic leeway not to be totally hamstrung and totally tied down, because you're going to basically not play any games and stuff. But we've all seen it. But I can't. I think we know now, if there was any unclarity, the government has been going around, both formally as the government in court, for the last couple weeks, and certainly on the public airways, saying the court said what it didn't say, just totally lying about what they said. And they've got to see that. And I this is where I think that, at least with Roberts and Barrett, I don't, they, it surprised me when they said, kind of like, get him out of custody, get him back here. But once they did, I don't think at least those two, and maybe more of them, are comfortable with Trump saying, okay, here's my take on that. Fuck you. He's not coming back. I don't think they're prepared to say, okay, fuck us. Sorry. And just kind of be humiliated like that.
Alito's dissent here also got at the heart of what I was worried about happening when we were kind of discussing this on Friday. I thought a big possibility is that the Supreme Court would just wait to do anything until, like, Monday or whatever, and then be like, "Rats. Too late now, they're in El Salvador," it's like nothing we can do.
Mhm.
So, that's also why I think the alacrity of clearly working at night, writing, getting it out clearly was, as you say, just like a sign in a more optimistic direction than I had been leading, because I don't think it would have been that hard for them to write something along Alito's lines that's like, well, we don't trample the lower court, right? Like, we wait for them to make their ruling first, and then we we rule, because it was unusual, right? It's unusual to leapfrog everybody else and go to the Supreme Court, and the reasons that they did it are clear. But sometimes the Supreme Court does this stuff where they, like, feign kind of that this whole thing is an academic exercise. So they're like, well,
Yeah.
you have to go through the proper steps before, we kind of come down from on high to rule. And here they clearly were just like grappling with the immediacy and the urgency of the substance of the situation, and not kind of like cowering behind the way that the procedural steps are usually done.
Yeah, and I again, I think you're saying that this seems to me to be clear evidence that they see how this is playing out, with that earlier with their not only ignoring but denying the existence of that earlier ruling, that they're clearly saying in their own head, look, we need to be really clear with you. You only seem to listen to us, and maybe not even that. So let me be 100% clear. We're not going to let you create a fait accompli. It is not happening. And that's, as you say, that is good for the forces of light. I mean, it's not everything, but it's better than the other alternatives.
Right. And, while this is all happening on two parallel tracks, the administration is kind of careening towards contempt charges. Boasberg's been working on this, and now that's getting appealed and everything. But in this separate case, um, about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, our listeners will remember that the last update there is the district judge is basically asking for, like, day by day status reports. Where is he and what are you doing to get him back? And the government's been playing all kinds of games, boilerplate. No, this is a secret. No, nothing changed. This is all we have to do to comply with the order, kind of misrepresenting the order and everything. And in the last hearing there, she just went off on him and was like, you're purposefully kind of misunderstanding the Supreme Court order. You're not listening to what I'm saying. You're doing all this bad faith stuff, yada, yada. I mean, hard to see a world where that doesn't head towards contempt as well, even though, you can argue small price to pay for not having to comply with court orders they don't want to.
And how does that play out in a case like this? Okay, say they are held in contempt. Who is they? Is it just the sort of the lawyer in the court? In which case, I would figure that Bondi would say, like, "Yeah, we got a bunch of them. We'll toss that guy in
Yeah,
the trash can and bring you someone else." How's that work?
Boasberg has tried to start identifying that, asking the lawyer kind of like who is making the shots here, who would I find in contempt? And
Right,
at least last time he did that, Ensign just basically wouldn't really comply, was not giving a lot of names, just kind of staying mum on it. So you have to find the people to hold in contempt. And then you also have the problem that who enforces that,
right,
usually the attorney general. But Boasberg also held out the possibility that if it comes to that, and if Bondi's like, yeah, we're not prosecuting, then some kind of special prosecutor situation where the court could, kind of assign someone to do that. But then you just start getting into a land which feels not fantastical, but difficult to imagine, right? They could do civil contempt and kind of stick more with like daily fines kind of thing. Every day you don't agree, blah blah blah. But when it comes to jail, not saying it couldn't happen, it just starts to feel a little less likely. I mean, for one
right.
thing, you need the marshals to put the person in jail, and they're controlled by the executive branch. So I don't know, this is
Work in
all
the executive. I mean, they're not. This gets to another one of those sort of weirdnesses, is that they're supposed to answer to the. They work for the judiciary, so it's it. But I take your point. I mean, they are housed in the Justice Department, and this
right.
sounds like you know, uh, you know, tailor made to any unitary,
Yeah,
unitary authority argument that kind of like it's they work for our company. It's not
right.
happening.
So I mean, this is all the murkiness that crops up when you're like tiptoeing up to the line of a constitutional crisis. But there is just one thing before we move on that I've been thinking about a little bit. We haven't fully gotten to the time yet where the Trump administration is comfortable, at least publicly, kind of saying like, fuck them judges type thing. Like they're still pretending that they're acquiescing with the Supreme Court order and just misrepresenting it. And I know that might seem like a fine distinction, but I do think it reveals that they're not totally confident that if they just outright buck a Supreme Court order, that won't bring back negative ramifications on them. Whether that just be kind of an mass protest or, public backlash or losing finally peeling off some elected Republicans or something like that.
I think they're right. I think that is a line that will I backlashes can come and go, but I think that is we see it everywhere. We see it in polls that are overwhelming. You can't not do what a judge says. You even see it from a lot of the toadiest members of Congress saying, "Oh, it gets a little kinetic. It's a little, Trump's a little rough and tumble, but obviously at the end of the day, you got to do what the court says." So I think they get that. There was in back in the days of the Spanish Empire, there was this thing, and some of this was because in those days you sent a letter back to the king. It's like a 3 or 4 month round trip. They had this thing where they would, and it's in Spanish, obviously, but the translation is "I obey, but I do not comply," which is basically like I obey, I follow your commands, but what it was usually in theory meant to say is, but there are things you don't know yet because you know takes 3 or 4 months for the message to get back and forth. So I'm obeying, but it turns out I can't really do quite what you said because you couldn't have meant what you seem to have said because it wouldn't make sense with the new facts. And I think the in a somewhat different to a degree, and one of the reasons why this worked in those days was because again of the 3 or 4 months that the people back in Madrid also didn't quite know what was going on, and you couldn't tweet. Philip II couldn't tweet out "You're fired," something like that. But the Trump people are kind of trying to do that. Like, oh, we would never. We always follow court orders. It just everybody's misunderstood this one. It's not
Right.
quite, blah 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 blah. So, yeah,
Okay, so we're going to end this episode talking about the death of Pope Francis, which happened on Easter Monday. Pretty metal for a pope, I'd say, to go out in the
strong
most
power move. Yeah,
important time in the Catholic calendar. He'd been ailing for some time. He's kind of in and out of the hospital and having respiratory problems. Notably, he met with JD Vance just before his death.
like
My
hours.
favorite my favorite headline was Jezebel's Pope Francis dies 7 hours after meeting with alleged Antichrist JD Vance. I just think alleged is really good there. So and oh wait, say the way that you found out.
I found out I don't always sleep well, and I got up in the middle of the night and I just checked my phone, and for some providential reason, I looked at Instagram, and the Vatican had posted for the first time about Francis's death literally 1 minute before. So somehow I happened to wake up just as the news was breaking before it was sort of everywhere. And so that was uh I even thought for a moment, like, did they get hacked? Like, it just it even though he had been in, as you say, he had he had been in the hospital for like a month, where it seemed at many points that he was dying. um and and then he got out of the hospital, and he seemed, at least, he's obviously in very poor health, but he seemed like, anyway, that was how I found out.
And I found out from a tweet that said JD Vance killed the Pope. So we all come to this in different ways. Um, yeah, I don't know. Felt very sad about it in a way that I didn't totally expect to. Because I think the last time I really like kind of clocked in with what Francis was doing was during the election. At some point, he had some comment about how some like allusion to the American election that was kind of one side are baby killers and one side are mass deportationists. So like weigh your conscience, in different words, but kind of like that. And that um I found that like a little bit hard to swallow.
Hmm.
But beyond that, his legacy has been, that he's a pope for the poor, right? From the beginning, he kind of did away with a lot of the ostentatious stuff and the cushiness of being a pope. He, as a kind of a son of immigrants, made the humanity of the immigrant a huge centerpiece of his papacy, which has been striking given how much anti-immigrant fever has obviously seized the United States, but like huge parts of the entire world. Um, there have been, a lot of nice videos circulating that I think shows like who he was to people, a lot of kissing the feet of AIDS patients and, you know, letting children come to him, more kind of humble aspects of Catholicism that have, kind of been worn away in recent popeships. Um, and the JD Vance meeting was interesting because not only the whole JD killed the Pope thing, which is like absolutely hilarious, but Francis has been harsh about the Trump administration, even if it's come in kind of like veiled, ways that the Pope kind of has to operate in. Um, Especially about the dehumanization of immigrants. And this is all, part of he talked about gay people with much more tenderness and affection than they've been spoken about before. He was a huge on stewardness of the earth, right? Stewardship of the earth, that climate change is like a really fundamental sin. So all this added up to make him, I think, the most progressive pope of my lifetime. And then he kind of reworked the hierarchy as well and did these, meetings for the curia in Rome, did a lot of work to like decentralize the hierarchy by appointing a lot more cardinals from the global south and much more impoverished countries, which is now kind of leading to an interesting conclave because he while he appointed, I think, something like 4/5 of the cardinals, you've
Yeah.
got something of less known entities, right? Because so many of them are from regions of the country that have, or of the world, that just haven't been represented before. So, um, people are kind of doing horse race stuff about who the new pope is going to be. Um, and as far as I can tell, I think it's hard because Catholic politics don't necessarily just operate on the like left to right scale as American ones. And so when you're
Yeah.
trying to put that over top, it's not exactly neat. But there seems to be at least a guy from the Philippines and a guy from Ghana who are at least seen as kind of potentially top contenders who share
Hmm.
Francis's social justice oriented kind of reform mindset and would also be, you know, the first Asian pope.
Yeah.
So,
Which is
you know,
obviously like a seismic. obviously, most Catholics, the vast majority of Catholics don't live in Europe,
Right.
or in North America, but it still would be a seismic change.
And would mean that we will hear the phrase DEI Pope within weeks. So,
Right, right, right. The one thing that really uh, uh, struck me is, as you said, that there's so many aspects of the politics of the church that just don't line up at all with not only American partisan politics, but even the big sort of social issues that are so electric in American politics. But beyond that, as you were just saying, in addition to being, by our sense, a fairly progressive pope, he was also much less authoritarian within the governance of the church than certainly his two predecessors. And one dimension of that could have a paradoxical effect, and that was, as you said, his main his main pattern in appointing cardinals was he left a lot of archdioceses that almost are usually like automatically cardinals, left those archbishops not cardinals, and appointed lots of people, archbishops to cardinals from the peripheries of the church, literal and figurative peripheries of the church. But in doing that, he was either balanced or indifferent to their traditionalism versus progressivism thing. He appointed lots of both. And in addition to a lot of these people being lesser known, that one of the things that was so improbable about Francis's elevation is that both John Paul, who obviously has in many ways a pretty strong reputation, and Benedict, who has a fairly weak reputation, which is ironic because he's a fairly big figure in the before he was pope, were quite authoritarian, and like absolutely were appointing people who shared their traditionalism. And so you could have a reversion, and it is, I know it's not an absolute, but in general, um, a lot of the hierarchy from the global south, from what we used to call the third world, is pretty traditionalist in their in by the things that we focus on in American politics. You know, Liturgically traditionalist on sort of the gender and sexual doctrines, women in the priesthood, women in the church, all these kind of things. So it's an unknown. I mean, one of the I have had in my lifetime, there have been three popes who I was old enough to have any sense of that there was such a thing as the Pope. Um, and that goes. I remember the conclaves. I guess it was in 1978, where they had John Paul I, who died a month after he became Pope, and then John Paul. And I had very warm feelings towards this Pope, not just because in some sense he, uh, you know, matches my politics at some level, although that's a very superficial way to put it. There is that focus on humility. And one of the things I think certainly a lot of Catholics know this, but the first Pope, and I think forever, who declined to live in the papal palace. There's a palace, and I think everybody understands that there's always, in a hierarchical church, there is at least some cognitive dissonance of a religion that is based in many ways on poverty and abnegation, having a papal palace, right? And there's all sorts of history to the church and the papacy that is why that did. But there was like a little bungalow. I mean, more than a bungalow, but certainly compared to the papal palace, called basically St. Martha's house, that he decided to live in, which was pretty stunning when he did it. And I'm actually very curious now. I think I feel like it it would be kind of hard for the next pope to like, forget that, man. I've been eyeing that papal palace forever.
right.
I'm totally doing that. I mean, and so I don't know if it'll permanently become this. It's possible that the papal palace will in the future become a semi-museum to papal humility,
Right.
right? If no one wants to turn that back. One of the things that was very strange about Francis was that for most of his uh, priestly career, he was known as being quite conservative, doctrinally conservative. Um, and so it was a surprise to many people. But there was an interview, I think it was with the guy he appointed to the position that Ratzinger had before he became Pope. The office of doctrine. I can't remember exactly what it's called. I think it was with the current occupant of that office who Francis appointed. He said that when Francis and again, this is the doctrine chief, right? It's that office is the enforcer of doctrine. So it's a kind of, something that's what that person does. And what Francis said is he thought, according to him, this is what Francis told him when he appointed him, was that he thought they would spread Christianity and keep it vital by demonstrating what Christianity was more than trying to control people and enforce belief. And that was very interesting to me when I heard that, because it kind of made sense of his whole life as a priest, because he didn't change much of any doctrine of the church. He loosened what a few of them meant. Didn't change anything about the church's view of homosexuality, certainly not of women in the priesthood. But he had this one encyclical, I think it was an encyclical, where he basically said, look for ways to bless gay couples, maybe, kind of bring them into the community of the church, which didn't, there was no doctrine against that, kind of the church is a church of sinners, right? But it was striking to me that I think with Francis, I think there are many people who are not Catholics, not Christians, not theists, who see the last dozen years of Francis' life when he was Pope, and say something like, I appreciate that, what that seems to say about Christianity. I respect that. I can even embrace that, and I think that is how I interpreted what Francis was trying to tell that other cardinal, which is that you are going to achieve more by in the good sense of the word, performing Christianity, than trying to kind of do what Ratzinger Benedict did, was constantly clamping down on everybody and silencing people and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, I would just say, this is just a personal thing, but my upbringing was very steeped in Catholicism. I've literally only ever gone to Catholic school, through college. I have a family member who's a Jesuit. My mom works for the Sisters of Mercy and has, since I was born. And so I spent a lot of my childhood in the convent where she worked, around nuns. And it gave me this unique perspective into Catholicism, because nuns are like the unflashy hands of Catholicism. Like, the women that I knew and know were doing the hard, brutal works of social justice, like frontline on homelessness in Philadelphia, running battered women shelters, like just running the gamut. And then, as I kind of got older and met a lot of priests, and they tended to live differently, a lot more flashiness, a lot more cushiness, a lot of pomposity that just none of these nuns ever had, and all of that kind of funneled into what has happened to the Catholic Church over my lifetime. I mean, the sexual abuse, scandal is too small a word, an earth-shaking betrayal. And I have personally found the abortion doctrine pretty difficult to live with. And Francis was someone that I felt for the first time kind of like mirrored the ethos of the nuns that I had grown up in, who was getting back to this idea that living out your Catholic faith should be about getting dirty and, interfacing with people who are on the margins. What I've always thought is the best part of Catholicism, the idea that, like prayer isn't enough, going to church isn't enough. You have to like live out your life. As you say, you have to like show people what Catholicism is about by, being a kind, welcoming, accepting person. And it was just, I think, especially profound given that, and this goes beyond Catholicism, but given how Christianity has been so thoroughly hijacked by the right and distorted into this thing that is, cruel and exclusive and gives cover to all of these like dark acts of humanity. And so it was just nice to have a figure that I felt, reflected the things that I liked about Catholicism. And I just, I really hope that the next pope is not some kind of pendulum swing back to the right, because I just feel that I know the pope's power is limited, but that we are just in such desperate need for like a figure on the global stage who stands against the kind of, these traits that come with the right wing. And again, I know the valences don't map on well, but it was profound to have someone as important as the Pope say what you're doing to immigrants is inhumane and horrible. To have a Pope who called into the Christian congregation in Gaza every day since the war started to like check in on them and ask what they ate that day. It's important to have someone doing that. So, I hope that Francis's legacy in that way does live on with, the next person who's chosen.
One other thing that I I'm at war with myself here because I want to give you as you and you as the Catholic the last word here. But there's one other thing I wanted to share. So you think of something else, so you can still have the last word. There in one article I read, they had some quotes from one of his not just biographer but official biographer, and someone who so who'd worked with him, someone who was very close with him. And this person said that earlier in his life and in his character, that Francis was in many ways, a kind of authoritarian and domineering person, and that he had at some point of his life he had taken on what he called a willed humility, right? Not something that is instinctive, but something that is willed as part of one's as part of one's spirituality. And I was very struck by that because the things that are most important about all of us are the things that do not come naturally. We can the things that come naturally to us, we are are neither our fault nor deserve praise. They're just kind of how we were built, right? And so I was very struck by that. I was very struck by that. Um, can you help me here and have one more thing
Okay,
to
I guess
say?
the last thing I said, this is not profound, but I was just waiting for Trump to say something really weird. Like I don't think he's ever addressed the a big profound moment without
Yeah,
just saying something that sounds like a little bit like an alien come to earth who doesn't quite know what to say. In the
yep.
category of like, Frederick Douglass, more and more people are talking about him, like something of
Right.
that
Yeah.
bent. Um, and mostly everything that he said was like kind of nice. I also thought he might be a dick about it, but I think that like he is so like uninterested in religion that it hasn't really like permeated his brain whether or not Francis like liked him or not.
Right. Right.
But I did get what I was kind of seeking in the end, because I think he addressed it, or his first comments about it or something was when he was standing on the balcony with Melania next to the stupid Easter bunny. Like there he made some comments or had a moment of silence or something, and the Easter bunny is just like standing there head bowed. um so we got that, and then he tweeted out that he, or Truth Social, that they're going to the funeral, and I believe he ended it with a "looking forward to it!" exclamation point, a normal reaction to attending a funeral. So
Yeah.
we got the Bizarro World reaction in the end.
What was it? Be there, it'll be lit. What was his thing on January 6th? It will be
Oh,
wild.
it'll be wild,
It'll be
right?
wild.
And now every other world leader has to like cancel their meetings with JD Vance. So
Yes, yes.
the
It's
touch of death.
wear a mask. Yeah, exactly. All right. I think you saved me by having the last word there. I think that is the last word. I think that's all we got. Anything else?
That's it. See you next week.
All right, later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.